There are objects in this world that sit quietly on shelves in attics, in estate sales and forgotten corners of antique shops, waiting. They appear ordinary at first glance, functional, simple, the kind of thing you'd pass by without a second thought, perhaps even dismissing as worthless, as obsolete, as nothing more than a relic of a time before electricity became the heartbeat of our daily lives. But some objects carry secrets. Some objects have witnessed things. And some objects, if you're patient enough to look closely, if you're willing to run your fingers across their surface and ask the right questions, will begin to whisper stories that have been waiting decades, sometimes entire lifetimes, to be heard. This is one of those objects. This is the story of a 1950 typewriter. Let me paint you the scene first. Picture, if you will, an ordinary afternoon in the year 2019. The sun is slanting through the windows of an estate sale house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in New England. Dust particles float through the golden light like tiny ghosts, and the air smells the way old houses always smell, a mixture of mothballs, aged wood, and something indefinably nostalgic. Long tables are laden with the remnants of someone's life. China plates with delicate patterns, ceramic figurines with frozen smiles, stacks of paperback novels with yellowed pages, old photographs in frames that no one claimed. This was the life work, the accumulated possessions, the material evidence of 73 years of existing in this world. And now it was all being liquidated to the highest bidders. Among these ordinary treasures, and I use that word deliberately, because every object in the estate sale is both trash and treasure simultaneously, sat a typewriter, specifically a Remington Portable from 1950. It was black, or had been black once. Now its finish was dulled by time, marked by the fingerprint of countless hands, bearing the small scratches and dents that come from real use, real work, real life. The keys were yellowed ivory, worn smooth from repeated pressure. The ribbon was still threaded through its mechanism, a faded cloth that had once been red. It was, in every observable way, exactly what you would expect a 70-year-old typewriter to look like. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. The kind of machine that might fetch $15, maybe $20 in an auction, purchased either by a nostalgic millennial looking for aesthetic props or by someone who genuinely still needed to write. But here's where our story begins in earnest. Here's where attention matters. Here's where curiosity, that seemingly small human impulse to look more closely, to ask why something's the way it is, to refuse to accept the surface-level narrative, becomes a catalyst for everything that follows. A woman named Margaret was attending this estate sale. She was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of observant eyes that have learned, over decades, to see what others miss. Margaret was not wealthy. She was not a professional collector or a dealer in antiques. She was, in fact, a retired librarian and archivist, someone whose entire professional life had been spent in the careful preservation and cataloging of documents, in the understanding that objects carry information, that history lives in the margins and the details and the things that people forget to mention. She had come to this estate sale not because she was looking for anything in particular, but because she had time now, in retirement, to wander and wonder, to spend afternoons in the company of other people's forgotten things. When she saw the typewriter, something made her stop. Perhaps it was the weight of use visible in its form. Perhaps it was a particularity of its condition, not so old as to be truly antique, not so new as to be modern, occupying that strange in-between space where objects become almost invisible because they're too recent to be historical and too outdated to be current. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something she couldn't quite articulate. The way a librarian's instinct sometimes works on a level beneath language, reading the world the way other people read books. She picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, which made sense. Typewriters were built to last, constructed from substantial metal and careful engineering, designed to absorb the violent impact of fingers striking keys hour after hour, day after day, year after year. She turned it over in her hands, examining it. The serial number was worn but still visible. Manufactured in 1950, which meant this machine had already lived 70 years in the world. She tried the keys. They still moved, still responded, though with a slight stiffness that spoke of age and disuse. The carriage still rolled. The mechanism still functioned, more or less. What Margaret did next was what a librarian does. She began to examine the object more systematically, more carefully. She looked at the maker's stamps and the patent dates. She checked the condition of the rubber rollers and the integrity of the spring mechanisms. She was, in essence, doing what archivists do with any historical object, trying to understand its provenance, its purpose, its place in time, and then, almost as an afterthought, almost as a matter of professional habit, she decided to look at the ribbon more closely. The ribbon, that faded strip of cloth that had been wound to the mechanism countless times, that had received the impressions of letters and words and thoughts transcribed by unknown hands into sentences that perhaps still existed somewhere in the world, or perhaps had been lost forever. The ribbon was, technically, still threaded through the machine, though it had long since dried out and become useless for any practical purpose. Margaret lifted it slightly, examining where it connected to spools, and that's when she noticed something unusual. Beneath the ribbon, in the space between the cloth and the metal guide that held it in place, there was something else, something deliberately hidden, or perhaps simply forgotten, or perhaps hidden and forgotten so long ago that the distinction had become meaningless. It was small. It was dark. It required closer inspection to fully apprehend. Where are you calling from? I want to know. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. Margaret did what anyone would do in that moment. She carefully, so very carefully, began to extract whatever was hidden beneath that ribbon, and what she found was a piece of paper, aged, yellowed, folded multiple times into the smallest possible size, as if someone would want to conceal it, to tuck it away, to hide it in plain sight within an object that was simultaneously intimate and public, personal and functional. A typewriter is, after all, a device for converting private thought into material form, for taking internal and making external. For someone to deliberately hide something within a typewriter was, in a sense, to hide something within the very machinery of expression itself. With the kind of care that only someone trained in archival work would possess, Margaret unfolded that piece of paper. What she saw changed everything. The paper was covered in handwriting, not typewritten text, but actual handwriting, the personal mark of an individual hand. The ink had faded to a light brown, but it was still legible. And the content of that writing was, in a single word, extraordinary. It was a letter hidden inside a typewriter, a letter that had been waiting 70 years to be found. But before we examine the content of that letter, we need to understand the context in which it was written, the historical moment it emerged from, the world that produced both the typewriter and the need to hide messages within it. Because this is not simply a story about an object. This is a story about people, about choices, about the kinds of secrets that human beings feel compelled to preserve even when preservation seems impossible, even when discovery seems unlikely. The year was 1950. The world had recently emerged from the devastation of the Second World War. The atomic bombs had fallen on Japan. The Holocaust had been revealed in all its incomprehensible horror. The world had reorganized itself into two great ideological camps, capitalism and communism, and the tension between these systems was beginning to shape every aspect of human society, creating fear, suspicion, and an atmosphere of surveillance that would intensify in the years to come. It was the beginning of what would be called the Cold War, a conflict not fought on battlefield with conventional weapons, but rather in the realm of ideology, of information, of loyalty and betrayal. In America specifically, this was a time of profound anxiety about communist infiltration. Senator Joseph McCarthy had not yet begun his campaign of accusations that would give rise to the term McCarthyism, but the seeds of that paranoia were already present in the culture. People were being questioned about their political affiliations, their reading habits, their associations. Books were being banned. Loyalty oaths were being demanded. The atmosphere was one of suspicion, of looking over one's shoulder, of never being quite sure who could be trusted. Into this context, we must place our typewriter, and we must understand that a typewriter in 1950 was not what a typewriter is today. Today, typewriters are nostalgic objects, retro props for aesthetic purposes, mechanical curiosities in a digital age. In 1950, a typewriter was an essential tool. It was how business was conducted, how literature was created, how ideas were circulated and preserved. To own a typewriter was to own a machine of expression, and in a time when expression was increasingly dangerous, increasingly surveilled, increasingly policed, that ownership carried weight and risk. The letter that Margaret found, that small, folded piece of paper hidden beneath the ribbon, was written in a woman's hand. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone with education and precision, someone accustomed to choosing words carefully. And the letter, when fully unfolded and read, told a story that spanned decades and touched on themes of loyalty, secrecy, political belief, personal sacrifice, and the ways in which history inscribed itself on individual lives. The letter was unsigned. There was no date written on the paper, though the ink and paper themselves suggested age consistent with the 1950s. But the content made clear that whoever wrote it had done so in a moment of great emotional intensity, great clarity, and great fear. The words themselves were simple, but their implications were profound. The letter spoke of friendship that had lasted many years. It spoke of shared beliefs in justice, in equality, in a better world. It spoke of man and a woman, of intellectual connection, of the kinds of bonds that form between people who see each other clearly, who understand each other, who believe in the same vision of what the world could be. But it also spoke of fear. It spoke of the growing danger of expressing such beliefs openly. It spoke of the need to hide, to be careful, to preserve connections that could not be openly acknowledged. And then it spoke of the typewriter itself. The writer explained, in veiled language, in careful terms that seemed designed to be understood only by the intended recipient, that the typewriter was not merely a machine for writing. It was a repository of secrets. It had been used to write documents that could not be safely preserved elsewhere. It had been used to compose letters that expressed thoughts that were increasingly dangerous to express. And now, those documents have been destroyed, burned, eliminated, as was necessary for survival in this new world. But the typewriter itself remained, because destroy it would have raised questions, would have been suspicious, would have drawn attention. Instead, the writer had hidden a message within the typewriter, a message to whoever might eventually find it, a message intended to bear witness, a message that said, essentially, this happened, we existed, we believed these things, we were not alone, and even though we must now be silent, even though we must now pretend to be other than what we are, we want someone to know that we were here, that we mattered, that our thoughts and our dreams were real. That message had been waiting for 70 years. When Margaret discovered this letter, her first instinct was to understand who had written it and why. She began to research. She looked at the serial number of the typewriter and traced its history. She contacted the Remington Company's historical archives. She posted inquiries on typewriter collector forums. She did what an archivist does. She gathered information. She cross-referenced. She attempted to build a narrative from fragments. But what made this search particularly poignant, particularly moving, was that Margaret quickly realized that the specific identity of the letter writer might never be known. The letter was unsigned. The typewriter might have passed through many hands over the course of 70 years. The historical moment it emerged from, the 1950s, the early Cold War, was a moment when records were destroyed, when documents were burned, when people deliberately erased evidence of their own beliefs and associations in order to survive. This realization that the truth of what happened, the identity of the people involved, might be permanently lost, became the central emotional core of the story. Because what Margaret had discovered was not simply a historical curiosity. What she had discovered was evidence of absence. She held in her hands proof that someone had wanted to preserve their story, their identity, their testimony, and that they had done so in a way that reflected their fear, their care, and their desperate hope that someone, someday, would understand. As Margaret researched further, she began to piece together the larger historical context. The early 1950s was indeed a time of intense political repression in America. People who had held leftist beliefs, who had been sympathetic to communist ideology, or who had simply advocated for social justice in ways that were perceived as radical, were being questioned, investigated, sometimes prosecuted. Some lost their jobs. Some were blacklisted from their professions. Some were driven into hiding, changing their names, moving to different cities, reconstructing their identities entirely. The typewriter itself became a kind of symbol in Margaret's mind, because a typewriter is an instrument of disclosure. It's a machine that turns private thought into public form. To hide something within a typewriter, to conceal a confession, a testimony, a witness statement within the very mechanism of expression, was almost poetic in its irony. It was as if the writer was saying, I cannot speak openly, but I will hide my voice within this machine of voice. I cannot be visible, but I will inscribe myself into the mechanism of visibility. Margaret began to wonder about the specific circumstances of how this typewriter came to be in that estate sale. Who had owned it during those intervening 70 years? Had they known about the hidden letter, or had it been lost to them, undiscovered? Had it passed through many hands, accumulating history and stories that were now irretrievable? The typewriter itself could not tell her these things. Objects, no matter how much they carry within them, cannot speak in their own voices. They can only be read, interpreted, understood through the stories that people project onto them, and the careful work of those who learn to listen to what objects are trying to say. What Margaret didn't know was that someone, in a moment of clarity and desperation 70 years earlier, had made a conscious decision to preserve testimony. They had written something down. They had hidden it carefully. They had entrusted it to time, to chance, to the possibility that someday someone would find it and understand. And that act of faith, because that's what it was, an act of faith, had been rewarded. The letter Margaret found has since been donated to an archive, where it is now preserved under controlled conditions, where its fragile paper protected, and where researchers and students and curious people can encounter it and attempt to understand the world it emerged from. Margaret herself has written about the discovery, has given talks about it, has placed this small piece of history into the broader conversation about preservation, testimony, and the ways in which ordinary objects can carry extraordinary weight. But the most profound part of the story, in many ways, is a question that the discovery raises but cannot fully answer. The question is, how many other typewriters are there? How many other objects in attics and antique shops and estate sales are carrying hidden messages? How many other voices from the past have been preserved in ways that we don't recognize, in ways that we walk past without seeing? How much testimony, how much lived experience, how much of the authentic human story has been hidden away, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care enough to look closely? Every object we encounter is potentially a message from the past. Every artifact carries within it the possibility of hidden history. The ordinary becomes extraordinary once we learn to see it, once we train ourselves to ask questions, once we develop the kind of attention and care that allows us to hear what objects are trying to tell us. The 1950 typewriter is still in existence. It is sometimes brought out for exhibitions, sometimes displayed in museums alongside the letter contained. And when people encounter it, something interesting happens. They don't see a broken, obsolete, worthless machine anymore. They see an active witness. They see a person, unknown and unknowable, who made a choice to preserve themselves, to leave evidence, to insist that their existence and their beliefs mattered. They see resistance. They see hope. They see a small, intimate act of defiance against a system designed to make people forget, to make people disappear, to make people stop mattering. That is the power of looking closely. That is what happens when we refuse to accept the surface-level narrative of an object, when we decide to ask questions, when we pay attention to the small details, the hidden spaces, the places where secrets might live. History is not always found in grand gestures or public monuments. Sometimes history is hidden under ribbons, tucked into the machinery of everyday tools, waiting for someone with the patience and the care to find it. And in finding it, in seeing it, in honoring it by bringing it into the light, we do something more than simply recover the past. We affirm the value of those forgotten voices. We say you mattered. Your story is important. Your existence, even if it had to be hidden, even if it had to be preserved in secrecy and fear, your existence was real and significant and worthy of preservation. That is the message that the typewriter carries, now as it did then. That is what Margaret found that afternoon at the estate sale, when she picked up an ordinary machine and decided to look more closely. And that is what we all might find if we develop the habit of attention, if we learn to see history not as something distant and irrelevant, but as something intimate and present, woven into the objects we encounter, waiting patiently to be understood. The 1950 typewriter reminds us that every object has a story. Every artifact is a potential testimony. Every machine, every tool, every remnant of human life contains within it the possibility of revelation. We have only to learn to look, to listen, and to honor what we find. But the story does not end with Margaret's initial discovery. In fact, what began that afternoon at the estate sale would only deepen, would only grow more complex, more layered, more emotionally resonant as Margaret pursued what she had found. Because once you open the door to hidden history, once you begin to pull the threads of the past, you quickly discover that those threads are connected to other threads, woven into larger tapestries that extend far beyond what you initially expected to find. After carefully preserving the letter and documenting its discovery, Margaret decided to conduct what might be called a biographical investigation. She wanted to know, as much as humanly possible, who the person was who had written those words. She wanted to understand the context, the relationships, the specific historical moment that had produced this act of witness. And while she knew that complete certainty might never be possible, that the writer had deliberately made themselves anonymous, after all, she believed that there were traces, clues, fragments that might be gathered and assembled into something approaching understanding. Her first step was to research the typewriter itself more thoroughly. She contacted the Remington Company's historical division and was able to determine not just the year of manufacture, but also the approximate region where it had been shipped for sale. It had left the factory in 1950 destined for the northeastern United States, but after that, the official trail grew cold. There was no way to know who had purchased it originally, no way to trace its journey through the decades except through the circumstantial evidence embedded in the object itself. But Margaret was not deterred. She understood that objects accumulate traces of their use over time, and that these traces could be read like text by someone trained in the practice of attention. She looked at the specific, were patterns on the keys. Certain letters were worn more smooth than others, which suggested a pattern of use. The letters that were most worn were E, A, T, O, N, S, which are most commonly used letters in English text. But there were interesting anomalies. The letter R was less worn than might be expected. The letter C bore unusual wear on its edges. These small variations could indicate the types of words that were most frequently typed, perhaps scientific terms, perhaps proper names, perhaps technical vocabulary. Margaret also examined the platen, the rubber roller that the paper pressed against, and found that it bore faint impressions, ghostly remnants of words that had been typed and then the paper removed. It was impossible to read most of them clearly, but she could make out fragments, partial words, broken phrases, suggestions of sentences that had been committed to paper and then, presumably, destroyed. She brought photographs of the typewriter to a materials conservator, someone trained in the examination of historical objects, and asked for a detailed analysis. What she learned was that the machine showed signs of intense use over a relatively short period, perhaps 2 to 3 years, followed by very minimal use for the remainder of its existence. This pattern suggested that the typewriter had been actively used during a specific era, a specific moment in time, and then, for whatever reason, largely abandoned. The implications were clear. Whoever had owned this typewriter during that intensive period of use had then, at some point, decided to use it far less frequently, or perhaps pass it on to someone else who did not use it as intensely. The timeline became important. If the typewriter had been used intensively during the early 1950s, that would align perfectly with the historical moment of the Cold War's emergence, with the growing paranoia about communist infiltration, with the beginning of the McCarthy era. Someone, Margaret theorized, had used this typewriter to write documents or correspondence of a sensitive nature. And then, as the political climate grew more dangerous, as the risk of discovery grew more acute, they had stopped using it for that purpose or passed it on, or made a conscious decision to conceal what they had been writing. The letter itself provided some additional clues, though they were subtle and required careful reading. The handwriting analysis that Margaret commissioned suggested that the writer was a woman, probably between the ages of 30 and 50 at the time of writing, someone with significant education. The letter contained references to literature, philosophy, and political theory that suggested university-level study. The writer was familiar with Marxist theory, with discussions of dialectical materialism and historical forces, with a vocabulary of radical thought. But the letter also showed signs of deep personal connection. There were emotional moments of longing, moments of fear and vulnerability that suggested this was not merely an intellectual exercise, but something that carried personal stakes. As Margaret dug deeper into the archives and records of the 1950s, she began to develop a theory about what the typewriter represented. She hypothesized that it had belonged to someone involved in intellectual or political circles on the left, not necessarily a Communist Party member, but someone sympathetic to socialist ideas, someone who believed in racial equality and workers' rights and international solidarity, someone who had been part of the vibrant radical intellectual culture that had existed in America in the 1930s and 1940s, but which was being systematically destroyed by the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s. The evidence for this theory came from multiple sources. First, the content of the hidden letter itself, which spoke in the coded language of someone concerned about political surveillance. Second, the presence of certain books in the estate sale. Margaret returned to research what other items had been sold from that same household, and she discovered that the collection included works of Marxist theory, books about racial justice, novels by authors who were known to have leftist sympathies. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, the typewriter showed evidence of having been used to type formal documents, business letters, perhaps, or academic papers, or other official-looking correspondence. The wear pattern suggested that the same documents might have been typed multiple times, as if someone was creating different versions, editing, refining, perhaps preparing materials for circulation or publication. What emerged from this investigation was a portrait, necessarily incomplete and necessarily speculative, of a person or persons who had been engaged in intellectual and political work of a sensitive nature, who had used this typewriter as one of the tools for that work, and who had eventually been forced, by circumstances and by fear, to stop that work or to hide it, to become silent, to transform themselves into something other than what they had been. This realization hit Margaret with particular force because it connected to broader historical patterns that she was very familiar with from her work as a librarian and archivist. The 1950s were a time when thousands of Americans had been forced to recant their beliefs, to deny their associations, to transform their identities. Some had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and forced to testify about their political affiliations. Some had been blacklisted from their professions. Some had simply disappeared from public life, becoming invisible, living double lives, keeping their true beliefs hidden from the world. And yet, the existence of this hidden letter proved that even in the silence, even in concealment, something had survived. Someone had made the effort to preserve testimony, to leave a record, to insist that their existence had mattered. That act of preservation was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to accept complete erasure, a belief that someday someone might find what had been hidden and understand that they had existed, that they had thought, that they had believed, that they had loved. Margaret decided to write about her discovery. She composed an article for an academic journal focused on material culture and historical preservation, detailing the typewriter, the hidden letter, her research process, and her conclusions about what the object represented. The article was peer-reviewed and eventually published, and it attracted attention from historians specializing in Cold War America, from scholars studying the history of political repression, from curators and museum professionals interested in how ordinary objects could carry extraordinary historical weight. The publication of the article led to other developments. A small museum in New England, one dedicated to the social and political history of the region, contacted Margaret and asked if the typewriter and letter could be loaned for exhibition. Margaret agreed, and the object was carefully transported, placed in a climate-controlled display case with the letter positioned beneath special UV protective glass, accompanied by scholarly context and historical information about the era. The exhibition opened to public view on a cold November afternoon, and what happened next was unexpected and deeply moving. People came, not just academics and historians, but ordinary people, retired teachers, former activists, people whose parents or grandparents had lived through the McCarthy era, people who recognized in this typewriter and this hidden letter the story of their own families, their own histories, their own experiences of fear and concealment and survival. One woman, elderly and frail, came to the exhibition and stood for a long time in front of the display case. She did not speak, But tears ran down her face as she read the excerpts from the letter that were displayed alongside the object. Afterward, she asked to speak with the museum curator. She explained that her mother had been a political activist in the 1950s, someone who had held leftist beliefs and had been investigated by the FBI. Her mother had spent the last 40 years of her life never speaking about that period, never acknowledging what she had believed in, what she had fought for. The mother had recently passed away, and the daughter had found documents hidden in her mother's possessions, letters, notes, fragments of correspondence, that proved what the daughter had always suspected but had never been able to discuss openly with her mother. Standing in front of the typewriter and the hidden letter, she felt, for the first time, that her mother's experiences were being validated, that the silence and fear her mother had endured was being acknowledged and honored. This encounter became the catalyst for something larger. The museum decided to create a broader exhibition focused on hidden histories, on the ways in which people had preserved their stories in the face of political repression. They collected other typewriters from the era. They gathered letters, diaries, documents that had been hidden away. They interviewed descendants of people who had been active in radical movements during the 1930s and 1940s, and who had then been forced into silence by the Cold War era. The exhibition grew into something comprehensive and deeply moving, a testament to resilience, to the human drive to preserve meaning even in the face of systematic erasure. And throughout all of this, the 1950 typewriter remained at the center. It was the object that had started it all, the humble machine that had held within itself the power to unlock these broader stories, to connect individual experiences to historical patterns, to allow voices that had been silenced to be heard once again, even if only partially, even if only through the mediation of interpreters like Margaret. But what made the story even more profound was that several years after the initial discovery and publication of Margaret's article, new information came to light. A researcher conducting interviews with aging political activists from the Cold War era came across a reference to a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor had been active in radical circles in the late 1940s and early 1950s. She had been a writer and an intellectual, someone who had contributed articles and essays to small magazines and journals associated with the left. She had been questioned by the FBI. She had eventually left public life and had lived a quiet, private existence for the remainder of her life, never speaking publicly about her past. The researcher was able to confirm that Eleanor had owned a Remington portable typewriter in 1950, that she had used it intensively during the period when she was most politically active, and that the typewriter had eventually passed out of her possession. Based on stylometric analysis of the handwriting and the hidden letter in comparison with known samples of Eleanor's writing from published essays, there was compelling evidence to suggest that Eleanor might have been the one who wrote the letter, who hid it beneath the ribbon, who left this message for the future. Eleanor herself had passed away years before, so she could never be asked directly to confirm this. But the convergence of evidence, the timeline, the handwriting, the intellectual content, the specific references to friendship and shared belief, the biographical details that align with what was known about Eleanor's life, was striking. And perhaps most significantly, Eleanor's niece came forward and confirmed that Eleanor had indeed owned such a typewriter, and that Eleanor had been someone who lived with profound secrets, who had never spoken openly about her political beliefs even within her own family, who had died carrying those secrets with her. For Margaret, this confirmation was bittersweet. On one hand, it provided concrete evidence that her theoretical work, her careful analysis and research, had borne fruit. She could now, with reasonable confidence, attribute the letter to a specific historical person. On the other hand, the knowledge that Eleanor had lived her entire remaining life in silence, had never been able to publicly acknowledge what she had believed in or what she had fought for, was deeply saddening. Eleanor had hidden that letter in the typewriter hoping that someone would find it, but she had died never knowing whether anyone ever would. The discovery had come too late for Eleanor to receive any validation or recognition. Yet, in another sense, the discovery came in time. It came before Eleanor's memory had been completely obliterated, before everyone who had known her was gone, before the historical context had become so distant as to be incomprehensible. And the act of discovery, the act of bringing Eleanor's hidden testimony into light, created a kind of posthumous justice. It said, your existence mattered. Your beliefs were real. Your choice to hide your truth was an act of survival, not a weakness. And your attempt to preserve your story, to leave evidence of what you believed, was successful. We found your message. We understood. You were not erased. The typewriter, in the end, became more than just a historical object. It became a monument to resilience, to the human capacity to preserve meaning even in the face of systematic destruction, to the power of small acts of witness, to the possibility that hidden messages, if we listen carefully enough, can travel across decades and speak to us with clarity and urgency. Margaret established a program through the museum through which she worked with archivists and collectors to search for other typewriters, other objects from that era that might contain hidden letters or documents. She trained volunteers to examine machines carefully, to look for signs of hidden compartments or concealed messages, to think creatively about where someone fleeing political persecution might hide their testimony. And while most of these searches yielded nothing, occasionally something would be found, a fragment of a letter here, a scrap of handwritten notes there, another voice in the past, waiting patiently for someone to notice, to care, to preserve. The story of the 1950 typewriter and Eleanor's hidden letter became something of a case study in the emerging field of material history, in the scholarship focusing on how ordinary objects carry extraordinary meaning. Universities began to teach this story in courses about Cold War America, about political repression, about resistance and resilience. Students learning about this era in American history learned that the traces of that history were not confined to official documents and public records. They could be found in the most intimate, most unexpected places. They could be hidden in machines. They could wait for decades to be discovered. They could be preserved by acts of faith and hope across the expanse of years. And perhaps most importantly, the story of the typewriter and the letter contributed to a broader shift in how we think about history, how we understand the past, and how we recognize the value of what has been hidden, what has been lost, what has been silenced. It demonstrated that history is not only the province of the famous and the powerful, not only the record of public events and major figures. History is also the accumulation of small acts, small choices, small preservation efforts made by ordinary people trying to ensure that their existence would not be completely erased, that their beliefs would not be entirely forgotten, that someone, someday, would know that they had been here, that they had mattered. The typewriter still exists. It is still displayed in the museum, still cared for by curators who understand its significance. It has become a touchstone for visitors, a focal point for reflection on themes of concealment and revelation, on the cost of political repression, on the resilience of human beings faced with impossible choices. Visitors leave flowers in front of the display case. They leave written reflections on cards in the exhibition's feedback section. Some of them, like the woman who had a mother who lived through that era, find in the typewriter a way to process their own family histories, their own experiences of inherited silence and inherited pain. And the letter itself, that small, folded piece of paper with Eleanor's careful handwriting, remains one of the most poignant artifacts in the museum's collection. It is handled only by trained conservators, examined rarely and only under controlled conditions, but its presence is always felt, always acknowledged, always honored as a testimony of someone who refused to be completely erased, who made a choice to preserve herself even in the moment of her forced disappearance from public life. This, then, is the fuller story of the 1950 typewriter. It is a story about an object, yes, but more fundamentally, it is a story about people, about Eleanor, about Margaret, about all the others whose stories are hidden in the margins of history, waiting to be discovered. It is a story about the power of attention, about what happens when we decide to look closely at the ordinary, when we refuse to accept the surface-level narratives that we are offered, when we develop the habit of curiosity and care. It is a reminder that history is not something that happened to other people in distant times. History is happening right now, in the choices we make, in what we decide to preserve and what we allow to be forgotten, in the way we treat objects that carry human stories within them. Every artifact is a potential message from the past. Every object we encounter could be the container for someone's hidden testimony, someone's desperate hope that they would be remembered, that they would be understood, that they would eventually be found. The 1950 typewriter teaches us this lesson with particular clarity and particular grace. It teaches us that the most extraordinary revelations can emerge from the most ordinary sources, if we only learn to look, If we only develop the patience and the care to see what is hidden in plain sight, to hear the voices that are speaking to us across the distance of decades, to honor the choices of those who came before us to preserve their truth even when the world demanded their silence. And perhaps that is the most important message that the typewriter carries. Not the specific story of Eleanor and her hidden letter, though that is significant and moving, but the broader message about the value of looking closely, about the importance of preservation, about the human need to be seen and known and remembered, and about our responsibility to those who came before us to ensure that their stories, their beliefs, their existence does not disappear into the void of forgotten history. In attending to the typewriter, in treating it with the care and respect it deserves, we are not just honoring Eleanor, we are honoring everyone whose story has been hidden, everyone whose voice has been silenced, everyone who has made the choice to preserve something of themselves in the face of forces determined to erase them. We are saying, your existence mattered. Your story is worth preserving. You will be remembered. And that, ultimately, is what the 1950 typewriter is about. Not about a machine, not about a letter, but about the human capacity for resilience, for hope, for connection across time, and about our collective responsibility to listen to the voices of the past and to ensure that they are heard, that they are honored, that they are understood not as historical curiosities, but as testimony from people like us, who lived, who believed, who loved, who suffered, who chose to preserve themselves against the forces of erasure. The typewriter sits in its display case, black and worn and ordinary, a machine that has outlasted the woman who used it, a machine that has become a container for her truth, her memory, her witness. And for anyone who takes the time to look closely, to ask questions, to imagine the hands that operated those keys, to consider the thoughts that were transformed into words that were transformed into metal impressions on paper, for anyone who does this work of attention and imagination, the typewriter will speak. It will tell the story of Eleanor. It will tell the story of an era. It will tell the story of all those who chose to preserve themselves when the world demanded their silence. And in listening to that story, in honoring that testimony, we participate in an act of historical justice. We say, you were not erased. You were found. You will be remembered. Your story will be told. That is the power of the 1950 typewriter. That is the grace of the hidden letter. That is what happens when we learn to see history not as something distant and irrelevant, but as something intimate and present, woven into the objects around us, waiting patiently for someone to notice, to care, and to preserve.